In the grim darkness of the far future, there are fates far worse than death. The Imperium of man, that vast and terrible empire spanning 1,000,000 worlds, has refined the art of punishment over 10,000 years of continuous warfare and political machination. While execution by firing squad or the cleansing fire of the flamer might seem like the ultimate sanction, they are in truth mercies compared to what awaits those who fall from grace but are deemed too valuable to simply destroy. To be exiled in the Imperium is to experience a unique form of damnation, a banishment that strips away not just home and brotherhood, but often identity itself. Exile in Warhammer 40,000 exists on a spectrum of horror that defies easy categorization. At one end, we find the Space Marine forced to undertake a death oath, sent away from his chapter to complete an impossible task or die trying. At the other extreme lies servitorization, where the exile is not from a place, but from humanity itself. The Isam condemned, lobotomized, and transformed into a cybernetic slave that retains perhaps just enough awareness to understand what has been taken. Between these poles exists a constellation of punishments, each designed to extract maximum utility from those who have transgressed, while serving as a warning to others about the price of failure in a galaxy that knows no forgiveness. The Imperium's approach to exile reveals much about its fundamental philosophy. This is an empire built on the bones of countless worlds, where human life is the most abundant resource, and yet paradoxically, the most carefully hoarded. Every able body represents potential service to the Emperor, every skilled warrior a weapon against the endless threats that press in from all sides. To simply execute someone capable of fighting is considered wasteful, even sinful. As Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, once said, "To merely execute warriors who might still bring grief to mankind's enemies is a waste and a sin." This calculus of worth permeates every level of Imperial society, from the lowliest hive ganger to the mightiest space marine. If you have failed but can still serve, you will serve, whether you wish to or not. What makes exile particularly cruel in the context of the 41st millennium is the loss of identity it entails. The Imperium is not merely a political entity, but a faith, and to be cast out from it is to lose one's place in the divine order. For a space marine, his chapter is not just a military organization, but a brotherhood of demigods, the fulfillment of his transhuman purpose. To be exiled from that brotherhood is to become something less than what the Emperor's genecraft made him. For an Imperial Guard soldier, the regiment is family, purpose, and identity all woven together. To be stripped of those colors and sent to a penal legion is to die while still breathing. Even for the lowliest hive worker, to be exiled from the familiar structures of Imperial life and sent to a penal world or transformed into a servitor represents a severing from everything that once defined them as human. The methods of exile are as varied as the crimes that warrant them, each tailored to extract particular forms of suffering and service. Some exiles retain their agency and are sent on impossible quests, their armor stripped of honors and their names struck from the records until such time as they might redeem themselves through deeds of such valor that the stain of their failure is washed away in enemy blood. Others are fitted with explosive collars and herded into the most dangerous war zones as expendable shock troops, their lives measured in the minutes it takes for enemy fire to find them. Still others undergo transformations so profound that the person they were ceases to exist in any meaningful sense, replaced by a shambling mockery that serves the Mechanicus or the ecclesiarchy, until mechanical failure or enemy action finally grants the mercy of true death. Throughout this exploration of exile in Warhammer 40,000, we will encounter individuals whose stories illuminate the broader patterns of punishment and redemption in the Imperium. We will walk beside Space Marines stripped of their colors and cast into the void on death oaths that will almost certainly end in their demise. We will stand in the ranks of penal legions as they charge into gunfire, explosive collars primed to detonate at the first sign of cowardice. We will descend into the nightmare of servitorization and witness what remains when the mind is stripped away, but something, some fragment of consciousness, persists to experience the horror. And we will venture into the Eye of Terror itself, where the traitor legions have made their exile into an empire of its own, 10,000 years of bitterness and corruption, fermenting into something that might yet threaten terror itself. What emerges from this examination is a portrait of the Imperium at its most revealing. This is not the heroic empire of the propaganda posters, where noble warriors defend humanity against alien and demon. This is an empire that will use every part of a person, will squeeze out every last drop of utility before finally allowing them the peace of death. It is an empire where redemption is theoretically possible, but practically almost unattainable, where the path back from exile is littered with the corpses of those who tried and failed. It is, in short, exactly the kind of empire that could survive in a galaxy as hostile as this one, where any hint of mercy or softness would be exploited by enemies who know neither concept themselves. The Emperor's Judgment, Death Oaths and the Exile of the Astartes. Among all the forms of exile practiced by the Imperium, perhaps none carries quite the same weight as the death oath imposed upon a space marine. These warriors are the Emperor's finest, post-human killing machines, whose creation consumes resources that could equip entire regiments of the Imperial Guard. Each Astartes represents decades of training, surgical enhancement, and psycho-conditioning, an investment measured not just in material, but in the gene seed harvested from their Primarch's own genetic legacy. When such a warrior fails, the question becomes not whether to punish, but how to extract maximum value from the punishment itself. The Death Oath, known by various names across different chapters, represents the Imperium's solution to this problem. Rather than execute a space marine who has transgressed against his chapter's codes, he is instead given one final chance to redeem himself through the completion of an impossible task. This is exile in its purest form. The battle brother is stripped of all his honors, his armor defaced to remove chapter symbols and iconography, even the tattoos that mark his company and brotherhood burned from his flesh with lass cutters or acid. He is given a task, typically one so dangerous that survival is considered miraculous, and told that only by completing this quest will he be permitted to return to his chapter. Until then, he is dead to his brothers, his name stricken from the rolls, his deeds unrecorded and unremembered. The psychological impact of a death oath cannot be overstated. Space Marines are not simply enhanced soldiers, but warrior monks who have been shaped from adolescence to see their chapter as the very center of their existence. Their identity is constructed around their role within this brotherhood, their every action evaluated against the teachings of their Primarch and the expectations of their battle brothers. To be cast out from this structure is to lose not just companions, but purpose itself. The exile must continue alone, without the logistical support, the camaraderie, the sense of belonging that has defined every day since he was selected as an aspirant. He becomes a ghost, haunting the edges of Imperial space, seeking an enemy terrible enough that its defeat might wash away his shame. The case of Captain Uriel Ventress of the Ultramarines provides perhaps the most well-documented example of a death oath in practice. Ventress was a decorated officer, a rising star within his chapter, who had already proven his tactical acumen and courage in numerous engagements. His crime was not cowardice or incompetence, but rather the opposite, an excess of initiative that led him to deviate from the sacred Codex Astartes during the defense of Tarsus Ultra against a tyrannid hive fleet. When Inquisitor Cryptman ordered the exterminatus of Cordelis, despite the Ultramarines' alternative plan showing promise, Ventress found himself forced to choose between the Codex and the necessity of the moment. He chose the latter, and though his actions contributed to the Imperial victory, he had committed what the Ultramarines considered a grievous sin. The trial that followed revealed much about the Ultramarines' philosophy. First Captain Severus Agamemnon visited Ventris in his cell before the judgment was pronounced, speaking words that cut to the heart of why the Codex Astartes matters so deeply to the sons of Guilliman. The Codex Astartes' ultimate purpose is not to tell us how to be the ultimate space marine, Uriel, but how to be a loyal space marine. Without having to account for our actions, we Ultramarines would be no different nor better than the traitors of the Black Legion. This was not about military effectiveness, but about the safeguards that prevent loyal space marines from following the path that led Horus into damnation. By breaking from the Codex, Ventris had demonstrated the same independence of thought that, taken to its extreme, leads to heresy. Chapter Master Marneus Calgar pronounced the death oath. Ventris and his sergeant, Pausanias Lysane, were to seek out and destroy the Demoncolaba, a horrific creation of the Iron Warriors used to produce new Chaos Space Marines from human captives. This quest would take them into the Eye of Terror itself, that great wound in reality where the traitor legions had fled after the Horus heresy. For loyalist space marines to enter the Eye was almost certainly to court corruption or death. Yet this was precisely why the task was chosen. If Ventris could penetrate the heart of chaos itself, strike a blow against one of the Imperium's most hated foes, and emerge uncorrupted, then surely the Emperor himself would recognize the purity of his service. The journey that followed tested Ventris in ways that no amount of combat could have prepared him for. Exiled from his chapter, he and Pausanias took passage on a ship bound for the Cadian Gate, the primary route to the Eye of Terror. When the ship's Geller field failed and demons poured through the vessel, only Ventris and Pausanias survived. Taken captive by the demon Omphalos Demonium and transported to Medrengard, the demon world that served as the Iron Warriors' fortress. There, amidst landscapes of screaming metal and impossible geometry, they discovered not just the Demoncolaba, but also renegade space marines who had fled into the Eye rather than face execution by their own chapters. These renegades, led by former Raven Guard Shadow Captain Ardaric Varnes, represented another form of exile. They had not been given death oaths, but had instead chosen banishment over the certainty of execution. They lived in the twilight between loyalty and damnation, still possessing enough of their humanity to refuse full submission to chaos, but having abandoned all hope of ever returning to the Imperium they once served. Varnes saw in Ventris both a reminder of what he had lost and a fool walking willingly into the trap he had fled. Their uneasy alliance to assault the fortress of Warsmith Honsu revealed the different paths that exile could take. Ventris clung desperately to his purpose, to the hope that redemption was possible if only he could complete his task. Varnes had long since abandoned such hopes, seeking only to survive another day in a realm where survival itself was a kind of victory. The Demoncolaba itself proved to be horror beyond description, a fusion of human woman and demon that served as a living incubator for transforming human captives into new Chaos Space Marines. The mutations and failures of this process created the unfleshed, pitiable creatures that retained their loyalty to the Emperor, despite their twisted forms. In destroying this abomination and escaping Medrengard with the unfleshed in tow, Ventris fulfilled the letter of his death oath. But the question remained, could he ever truly return? The Ultramarines' answer was to subject Ventris and Pausanias to the most rigorous testing imaginable. They were examined by the apothecarian to ensure no biological taint, by the chaplaincy to confirm their spiritual purity, and most stringently by the Grey Knights themselves, the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus, who specialize in detecting and eliminating daemonic corruption. Only after this gauntlet of examination, after it was proven beyond any doubt that their souls remained untainted, despite their sojourn in the Eye of Terror, were they permitted to reclaim their positions within the chapter. Ventris had achieved what most considered impossible. He had walked through hell and emerged on the other side. Yet his story is exceptional precisely because he succeeded. The death oath is designed to be nearly impossible to fulfill, and most who undertake such quests die in the attempt. Their bodies are never recovered, their fates unknown, their sacrifices unrecorded. Some few join the Death Watch, that special chamber of the Ordo Xenos, where space marines from different chapters serve together to combat alien threats. The Death Watch welcomes exiles as black shields, warriors who have covered their chapter insignia and taken new oaths of service. For them, the Death Watch becomes a form of redemption without return, a way to die in service to the Emperor, even if they can never go home. Others, unable to complete their impossible quests and unwilling to join the Death Watch, simply disappear into the darkness between stars. Some become mercenaries, selling their skills to rogue traders or planetary governors. Some go mad, the isolation and loss proving too much for even a Space Marine's enhanced psychology to bear. And some, most tragically, turn renegade entirely, their bitterness at the Imperium that cast them out festering into active hatred. These are the ones who prove the wisdom of execution over exile, who demonstrate that sometimes the risk of losing a warrior to chaos outweighs the potential value of giving them a chance at redemption. The White Scars. Chapter has its own tradition of exile, known as the Magyar Mazan or the Scarred. Among the sons of the Khan, whose culture draws heavily from the nomadic warriors of Chogoris, exile carries particular weight. The people of that world understand justice in stark, uncompromising terms. Failure can be rewarded with death, but occasionally a merciful leader may commute this sentence to exile instead. The Magyar Mazan are those who have been cast out from their brotherhood, their company within the chapter, and are fated to seek an honorable death in battle. Unlike the formal death oaths of other chapters, the Magyar Mazan tradition allows for a measure of self-determination. The exiled warrior chooses his own path to redemption, his own enemies to strike down in his quest to wash away dishonor. During the Horus heresy, the Magyar Mazan tradition took on new significance. When elements of the White Scars conspired against their primarch Jagatai Khan, contemplating joining Horus's rebellion, they were given a choice upon discovery: death or exile. Those who chose exile formed the core of the Magyar Mazan, warriors who fought alongside their loyalist brothers but always in the most dangerous positions, always seeking the death that would redeem them in the eyes of their primarch. Some found that death, their names later restored to the chapter's roles of honor. Others survived the heresy and continued as Magyar Mazan into the uncertain years that followed, their exile becoming a permanent state that defined the rest of their long lives. This tradition reveals a truth about Space Marine exile that applies across all chapters. It is as much about the warrior's own psychology as it is about military effectiveness. The Death Oath or warrior's pilgrimage forces the exile to confront what his failure means, to wrestle with the knowledge that he has fallen short of the Emperor's expectations. Some find in this confrontation a renewed sense of purpose, a burning desire to prove themselves worthy once more. These are the ones who might actually succeed, who might complete their impossible tasks and return to their chapters as heroes. But others find only despair, the weight of their dishonor crushing their will to continue. For them, the Death Oath becomes simply a more elaborate form of execution, death delayed but ultimately inevitable. The chapters that make use of such traditions walk a careful line. On one hand, they recognize that their warriors are too valuable to waste through execution, that even a disgraced Space Marine represents centuries of training and enhancement that should be leveraged for the Imperium's benefit. On the other hand, they must maintain the standards that separate them from the traitor legions, must ensure that deviation from their codes carries real consequences. The Death Oath satisfies both requirements. It extracts service from the failed warrior while simultaneously reinforcing the importance of the rules he broke. It says to every battle brother who witnesses the exile's departure, This is what awaits those who fail. Learn from his mistakes, or share his fate. There is also an element of faith in the practice, a belief that the Emperor himself watches over these quests and guides worthy warriors toward redemption. When a Space Marine succeeds in his death oath, returning against all odds with his task completed and his soul uncorrupted, it is seen as a sign of the Emperor's blessing. The warrior has been tested in the fires of despair and exile and has emerged purified, proven in a way that those who never face such trials can never be. This explains why successful death oath completions are celebrated so fervently, why warriors like Uriel Ventris are welcomed back not just as forgiven, but as exemplars. They have demonstrated that redemption is possible, that the Emperor's grace extends even to those who have fallen, and in doing so, they validate the entire system of Space Marine justice. But we must not lose sight of the fact that for every Uriel Ventris who returns triumphant, dozens or perhaps hundreds of others simply vanish into the void, their bones scattered across forgotten battlefields or consumed in the bellies of Tyrannid, bioships. The death oath is designed to be a punishment, and its completion is meant to be the exception rather than the rule. The system works precisely because most fail, because the threat of exile and almost certain death is sufficient to keep most Space Marines firmly within the bounds of their chapter's expectations. In this, we see the death oath as a mirror to the Imperium itself, brutal, unforgiving, but shot through with just enough hope to keep the faithful striving toward an almost unattainable ideal. The exile walks alone through a galaxy that wants him dead, carrying the weight of his failure like a physical burden, knowing that even success may not be enough to regain what he has lost. It is a form of suffering refined to its purest essence, and it is considered one of the Imperium's mercies. Redemption, through annihilation, the penal legions of the Imperial Guard. If the death oath represents exile with a chance at redemption, the penal legions of the Astra Militarum represent something far more grim, redemption through guaranteed destruction. These formations are filled with the dregs of imperial military justice, men and women who have committed crimes serious enough to warrant execution, but who are instead given the opportunity to die in service to the Emperor. The difference between execution and assignment to a penal legion is purely semantic, a matter of how long it takes for death to arrive, rather than whether it will come at all. The Imperium produces penal legionnaires at a staggering rate. With billions of soldiers under arms across 1 million worlds, the potential for military crimes is virtually limitless. Cowardice in the face of the enemy, desertion, insubordination, murder of a fellow soldier, theft of imperial property, even something as simple as losing one's copy of the uplifting primer can all potentially result in execution or penal service. The Departamento Munitorum maintains an exhaustive catalogue of regulations, so comprehensive that violating at least some of them is nearly impossible to avoid. Commissars and officers wield the power of life and death, able to condemn a soldier to the penal legions with nothing more than their word and a stroke of a pen. What awaits those condemned is a fate that strips away everything that once defined them as soldiers of the Imperium. New legionnaires have their heads shaved, their unit insignia tattooed onto their foreheads or shoulders so that they can never hide what they have become. Around their necks go explosive collars, ingenious and terrible devices that are both control mechanism and constant reminder of their status. The collars are not designed to turn the wearer into a human bomb. The explosion is directed inward, killing only the condemned while leaving those around them unharmed. This is discipline reduced to its most brutal essence. Obey or die, advance or die, fight or die. The collar's detonator is held by the arbitrators or commissars who oversee the penal legion, men and women whose white uniforms and reflective visors mark them as separate from and superior to the criminals they command. The armament provided to penal legionnaires reinforces their expendable status. Where regular Imperial Guard regiments might receive specialized weapons, transport vehicles, or heavy support, penal legions are given the absolute minimum: a lasgun, basic flak armor that might stop a glancing blow but offers little protection against determined fire, and perhaps a few grenades. Some legions are equipped with friends-on dispensers, devices that inject combat stimulants directly into the bloodstream, flooding the user with artificial aggression and dulling their sense of pain and fear. Others receive slort, an even more dangerous drug that turns the user into a slavering berserker for the duration of its effect before the inevitable crash. These chemical aids are not kindnesses, but tools to extract maximum violence from men and women who know they are already dead. The tactical deployment of penal legions follows a predictable pattern. They are hurled at enemy positions in massed charges designed to test defenses and force the enemy to reveal their strength. While regular guard regiments conduct methodical advances supported by armor and artillery, the penal legions rush forward under threat of detonation, their massed bodies serving to absorb fire that might otherwise fall upon more valuable troops. The casualties are horrific. It is not uncommon for a penal legion to lose 70 or 80% of its strength in a single engagement. The survivors scrape together and hurled at the next objective, with scarcely a pause to tend their wounds. Yet within this nightmare of violence and despair, there exists a dark form of hope. Imperial doctrine teaches that those who serve in the penal legions can achieve redemption through sufficient bloodshed, that the Emperor watches over even the condemned and may grant his pardon to those who prove their loyalty through sacrifice. This hope is almost certainly false for the vast majority. The truth is that penal legionnaires are meant to die, and their deaths are meant to purchase tactical advantages measured in yards of ground, gained, or seconds of time bought for regular troops to maneuver. But the hope serves a purpose, keeping the condemned fighting even when rational calculation would suggest surrender or flight as preferable options. The 13th Penal Legion, known throughout the Astra Militarum as the Last Chances, represents both the pinnacle and the perversion of this system. Unlike the massed hordes that characterize most penal formations, the Last Chances are a small, elite unit drawn from criminals who possess particular skills that make them useful for specialized missions. They are commanded by Colonel Schaefer, a figure who has become legendary within both the Commissariat and the Inquisition for his ability to turn the condemned into surgical instruments of imperial will. Schaefer's approach differs fundamentally from that of other penal legion commanders. Rather than simply throwing bodies at enemy positions, he carefully selects his operatives, choosing murderers with exceptional aim, thieves with infiltration skills, tech heretics who understand machines in ways that ordinary soldiers do not. He then trains them ruthlessly, drilling them in tactics and weapons use until they function as a cohesive team, despite their criminal backgrounds. His missions are no less suicidal than those assigned to regular penal legions, but they require skill and coordination rather than simply mass and momentum. The most famous deployment of the Last Chances involved the destruction of Coritanorum on Typhos Prime, a city that had fallen under the control of a Genestealer cult. The mission exemplified Schaefer's methodology. The Last Chances were infiltrated into the city, fought their way through defensive positions that would have stopped a conventional assault, and ultimately detonated the city's power reactors in a massive explosion that annihilated both the cult and most of the Last Chances themselves. The few survivors were granted their pardons, their crimes wiped from imperial records, though whether they found peace after such horrors is another question entirely. Lieutenant Cage, one of the most notable Last Chances, illustrates the complexity of life in a penal legion. Convicted of murdering a sergeant over a woman, Cage found himself trapped in a cycle of violence and near death that defined his existence for years. He survived the destruction of Coritanorum only to murder again, driven by personal demons that even the threat of the explosive collar could not suppress. Recaptured by Schaefer, he was sent on another mission, this time to assassinate the Tau commander Brightsword. The operation succeeded, but Cage's story ended on Armageddon, where demonic possession led him to betray his team before he managed to reassert control long enough to hurl himself and the traitor Hermann von Straub from a balcony to their deaths. Kager's tale is instructive because it reveals the truth about redemption in the penal legions. It is nearly always purchased with death. Even those who survive one mission find themselves sent on another and another, until eventually the odds catch up with them. Schaefer might grant posthumous pardons to those who die fulfilling their duty, but this is cold comfort to the deceased. The system is designed not to rehabilitate, but to extract maximum utility from the condemned, squeezing out every last drop of combat effectiveness before finally allowing them the peace of true death. The psychological impact of service in a penal legion varies wildly depending on the individual. Some embrace their fate, charging into battle with the fervor of the truly penitent, seeing in their own deaths the only possible redemption for their crimes. These are often the ones who survive longest, paradoxically, because their willingness to face death makes them more effective soldiers. Others stumble forward like men already dead, going through the motions of combat, while their minds have already retreated to whatever memories or fantasies provide escape from their present horror. Still others rage against their fate, fighting with a desperate fury, born not of loyalty, but of sheer refusal to accept their doom. The rare survivors, those who live through enough missions to actually receive the Emperor's pardon, emerge as something neither fully human nor fully soldier. They have walked through hell repeatedly and somehow retained enough of themselves to continue functioning. Some become valuable assets to the Imperium, their skills and hard-won experience making them useful as scouts, assassins, or members of inquisitorial retinues. Others simply vanish, disappearing into the underhives or frontier worlds where their past will not follow them. A few return to regular guard service, though they are forever marked by the knowledge of where they have been and what they have done to earn their second chance. Yet for all the stories of survival and redemption, the overwhelming majority of penal legionnaires die in their first battle. They are herded into dropships or transports, given their orders by arbitrators, whose faces they will never see behind reflective visors, and sent forward into the teeth of enemy fire. Some die within minutes, cut down by weapons they never even saw. Others survive long enough to close with the enemy, to fight hand-to-hand in trenches or bunkers, or the corridors of void stations, before a blade or a bullet finds them. Their bodies are left where they fall, unremarked and unmourned, their passing noted only as a number in a casualty report that no one will ever read. The penal legions serve multiple purposes within the Imperium's military doctrine. Most obviously, they provide bodies for the meat grinder of constant warfare, expendable troops who can be thrown at problems that would otherwise cost the lives of more valuable soldiers. But they also serve as a warning and a tool of discipline. Every soldier in the Imperial Guard knows what awaits those who fail or transgress, knows that the explosive collar and the suicidal charge are real possibilities should they step too far out of line. This knowledge helps maintain order among troops who are already subjected to horrific conditions and expected to fight enemies that would break the sanity of lesser beings. There is also an element of propaganda to consider. The Imperium teaches that redemption is always possible through service and sacrifice, that even the worst criminal can find forgiveness in the Emperor's eyes if they but prove their loyalty through blood. The penal legions embody this teaching, demonstrating that the Emperor's mercy extends even to the condemned. The fact that this mercy almost invariably results in death is considered irrelevant. What matters is the opportunity for redemption, not the likelihood of achieving it. From a certain perspective, the penal legions represent the Imperium's approach to waste reduction taken to its logical extreme. Rather than simply executing criminals or imprisoning them at the cost of food and resources, the condemned are transformed into weapons, their lives spent to purchase tactical advantages. Even their deaths serve a purpose, their bodies creating obstacles for enemy advance or forcing enemies to expend ammunition that might otherwise be directed at regular troops. It is efficient, brutally so, and efficiency is a virtue that the Imperium cannot afford to neglect in a galaxy where every resource matters. But beneath the efficiency and the propaganda lies a darker truth. The penal legions exist because the Imperium produces them, because a system that criminalizes everything from cowardice to curiosity will inevitably generate an endless supply of the condemned. In some ways, the penal legions serve to hide a deeper failure of imperial society, a tacit admission that the system generates more broken people than it can afford to fix. Rather than address the root causes that drive soldiers to desert or civilians to rebel, the Imperium simply scoops up the failures and feeds them into the war machine, transforming social problems into military assets. Beyond the Emperor's light, penal worlds and death, world banishment. Not all exile involves service in the military or the chance, however slim, at redemption through combat. For many who fall afoul of imperial law, exile means transportation to one of the Imperium's penal worlds, entire planets designated as prisons where the condemned are sent to labor until death claims them. These worlds represent permanent banishment from the settled and civilized portions of the Imperium, a one-way journey to places where survival itself is an achievement and escape is impossible. Penal worlds exist across the galaxy, each with its own particular flavor of horror. Some are planets with toxic atmospheres where prisoners labor in sealed hab blocks and venture outside only in environment suits to mine precious minerals or harvest chemical compounds. Others are ice worlds where temperatures plunge to extremes that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. The prisoners forced to operate drilling rigs or geothermal plants that extract value from the frozen wasteland. Still others are death worlds proper, planets whose native fauna and flora are so hostile that simply existing requires constant vigilance and violence. Lost Hope serves as an illustrative example of what a penal world entails. Designated as such by the Administratum late in the 41st millennium, Lost Hope is an ice world located in a remote region of space, far from the established trade routes and populated systems that define most of imperial civilization. The planet's surface is scoured by winds that can strip flesh from bone, its poles marked by massive drilling stations that extract promethium from deep beneath the frozen crust. The administrators of House Kasky, who gained control of Lost Hope through bureaucratic maneuvering, established a penal colony to provide labor for these operations. The conditions on Lost Hope were designed not for rehabilitation, but for maximum resource extraction. Prisoners were worked in shifts that extended far beyond what safety regulations might suggest, their bodies pushed until exhaustion or accident claimed them. Food was minimal, provided in quantities calculated to keep prisoners functional but chronically hungry. Medical care was non-existent, except for injuries that might impact a prisoner's ability to work. Those who could not keep up were simply left outside the sealed habitation zones to freeze, their deaths serving as examples to the others. The governance of Lost Hope reveals much about how penal worlds function. Prison. Governor Irina Kasky ruled with absolute authority, her word literally law within the confines of the colony. She maintained order through a combination of physical punishment, deprivation, and the judicious use of violence. Escape was theoretically impossible. Even if a prisoner somehow managed to flee the hab blocks, where would they go? The planet's surface was lethal. There were no ships available to steal, and even if one could be commandeered, where in the galaxy would an escaped convict find sanctuary? Yet the story of Lost Hope also demonstrates that even the most oppressive prison systems contain within them the seeds of their own instability. When General Creed arrived, seeking to recruit 10,000 prisoners into penal legions, Governor Kasky's refusal triggered a chain of events that would ultimately see her killed, and her domain brought under proper imperial control. The prisoners, having suffered her cruelties for so long, were willing to ally with Creed despite their justified suspicion of authority. The promise of a meaningful death in combat proved more attractive than continued existence in the frozen hell of lost hope. This pattern repeats across penal worlds throughout the Imperium. The conditions are designed to break spirits and extract labor, but humans are remarkably resilient, even in the face of such oppression. Some prisoners maintain their sense of self through clinging to the hope of eventual release, even though such releases are vanishingly rare. Others find meaning in small acts of resistance or in maintaining relationships with fellow prisoners. A few even thrive in the harsh environment, rising through prisoner hierarchies to positions of relative comfort and power. The crimes that result in transportation to a penal world vary enormously depending on the world of origin and the whims of local authorities. On some worlds, theft of imperial property might warrant merely a fine or a period of enforced labor. On others, the same. Crime results in immediate transportation to the nearest penal world. Murder might earn a death sentence on one planet and penal servitude on another. The only constant is that the Imperium maintains a supply of penal worlds sufficient to absorb the criminals generated by its vast and sprawling civilization. From a logistical perspective, penal worlds serve several functions. Most obviously, they remove troublesome elements from the population, ensuring that criminals cannot continue to destabilize the societies from which they came. They also provide labor for operations that would otherwise require expensive automation or the commitment of free workers who might be better employed elsewhere. Mining operations, in particular, benefit from penal labor, as the dangerous conditions and high fatality rates make it difficult to attract voluntary workers, even with substantial pay. But there is also a propaganda element to penal worlds. They serve as physical evidence of the Imperium's reach and power, proof that there is nowhere in the galaxy so remote that imperial justice cannot find you. The knowledge that transportation to a penal world is a possible consequence of crime serves as a deterrent, helping to maintain order in populations that might otherwise turn to rebellion or lawlessness. The penal worlds are held up as examples of what happens to those who transgress, and the implicit message is clear: obey or suffer. Death worlds represent a variation on the penal world concept, though they are not always used exclusively for criminals. A death world is any planet whose environment or native life forms are so hostile that human habitation requires constant struggle for survival. Some of these worlds are inhabited by hardy populations who have adapted to the extreme conditions over generations, producing some of the finest soldiers in the Imperial Guard. The Katakhan jungle fighters, for instance, are legendary for their toughness and survival skills, products of a world where everything from the smallest insect to the largest predator seems designed to kill humans. But death worlds also serve as convenient dumping grounds for those the Imperium wishes to exile without the expense of maintaining a formal prison infrastructure. Simple banishment to a death world is often sufficient punishment, as survival becomes its own form of torture. The exile must face predators that can tear apart armored vehicles, plants that excrete toxins capable of dissolving flesh, weather patterns that shift from deadly heat to freezing cold with little warning. Many exiles last only days or hours, their bodies consumed by the planet's ecosystem before they can even begin to adapt. For those few who do survive banishment to a death world, life becomes an endless struggle. They must learn to find or create shelter, to identify which local flora and fauna are edible and which are lethal, to avoid the myriad dangers that lurk in every shadow and rustle, in every undergrowth. Some forge alliances with local populations if such exist, trading skills or labor for protection and knowledge. Others go feral, living like animals and slowly losing the trappings of civilization. A very few manage to thrive, becoming hunters or guides who know the world's dangers intimately and can navigate them with hard-won expertise. The Imperium's use of death worlds for exile reveals a certain elegant brutality in its approach to punishment. Rather than expending resources to execute or imprison someone, they are simply deposited on a world that will almost certainly kill them, but which offers the slimmest possibility of survival for those strong, clever, or lucky enough to adapt. The exile's death becomes a matter of when rather than if, but the Imperium's hands remain nominally clean, the planet itself serving as executioner. There is also an element of testing in Death World exile. Those who survive demonstrate qualities that the Imperium values: resilience, adaptability, the will to live even in the face of overwhelming odds. Some of these survivors are eventually recruited back into Imperial service, their experience on the Death World having transformed them into valuable assets. They might serve as scouts for military operations, as guides for exploration missions, or even as trainers teaching others how to survive in hostile environments. Their exile becomes a trial by fire that proves their worth. Yet we must not romanticize this process. For every exile who survives and is redeemed, hundreds or thousands die in agony and terror, their screams unheard, their passing unmarked. The Death Worlds care nothing for the Imperium's purposes or the exile's potential. They simply kill, with the indifference of natural law, and the Imperium benefits from the small percentage who somehow endure. Penal worlds and death worlds also serve as sources of recruitment for the penal legions discussed earlier. When the Astra Militarum requires fresh troops for suicide missions, administrators often turn to the penal worlds as ready sources of expendable bodies. The prisoners are given a choice, though calling it a choice perhaps overstates their agency: remain on the penal world and labor until death, or volunteer for the penal legions and die in combat serving the Emperor. Some choose the former, preferring the devil they know to the unknown terrors of war. Most choose the latter, reasoning that a quick death in battle is preferable to a slow one in the mines or factories. The cycle is self-perpetuating. Crimes generate prisoners. Prisoners are transported to penal worlds. Those who survive the penal worlds are recruited into penal legions, and the few who survive the penal legions are either pardoned or sent on further missions until they finally fall. The system extracts every possible measure of utility from those who enter it, ensuring that even the condemned contribute to the Imperium's survival before they are finally granted the mercy of death. In this, we see exile not as a single punishment, but as a process, a journey from transgression through various forms of suffering, until finally arriving at the only true release the Imperium offers. The penal worlds are way stations along this path, places where the condemned are stored and utilized until they are needed elsewhere, or until they simply expire from the conditions imposed upon them. It is efficient, it is terrible, and it is utterly typical of the Imperium's approach to its human resources. The ultimate exile, servitorization, and the death of the self. If penal legions and exile to hostile worlds represent punishments that at least acknowledge the condemned as still human, servitorization represents something far more absolute. To be transformed into a servitor is to be exiled not from a place or a community, but from humanity itself. The very essence of what made you a person stripped away and replaced with simple programming and mechanical augmentation. It is death while the body lives. Consciousness reduced to fragments that may persist just long enough to understand what has been taken. The process of servitorization begins with a sentence: servitude in perpetuis, service eternal. This punishment is reserved for crimes that the adeptus arbites or planetary authorities deem too severe for simple execution, yet not heretical enough to warrant the purifying flames of the pyre. The convicted criminal is handed over to the adeptus mechanicus, whose tech priests will perform the transformation. What happens next is described in sources as immensely painful, though the degree to which the subject remains conscious during the procedure varies. The mind-wiping process involves both chemical and surgical intervention. Lobotomy is standard, targeted destruction of brain tissue that eliminates higher cognitive functions while preserving the basic ability to follow commands and operate bodily systems. The nervous system is then modified, neurons rerouted or replaced with mechanical interfaces that allow direct control through electronic impulses. Cybernetic implants are grafted onto or into the body, replacing limbs, organs, or entire systems with augmetic equivalents designed for specific tasks. The servitor that emerges from this process bears only a physical resemblance to the person who entered. The capacity for independent thought has been destroyed or so severely curtailed that it effectively no longer exists. The servitor can follow programmed routines, can perform the specific tasks for which it was designed, but it cannot learn, cannot adapt, cannot question or refuse. It is a biological robot, a fusion of flesh and machine that serves the same function as the abominable intelligences that the Imperium has forbidden since the dark age of technology. Yet the horror of servitorization lies not in what is destroyed, but in what sometimes remains. Sources disagree on whether servitors retain any consciousness, but there are disturbing hints that at least some of them do. Physical trauma can sometimes cause fragments of the servitor's former personality to resurface, leading to episodes of mindlock, where the servitor babbles incoherently, trying to assert some form of awareness against the programming that constrains it. Some servitors have been observed saying, "Help me," over and over, an endless plea that suggests something inside still understands its condition and wants release. In the novel Flesh and Steel, one character experiences a form of consciousness even after servitorization, aware of their state but unable to act against it. The narrative describes fragments of memory surfacing, images of the person they were before, and the horror of understanding what has been done to them while being powerless to change it. This suggests that servitorization may not fully destroy consciousness, but merely imprison it, trapping a fragment of the person's awareness inside a body they can no longer control, forced to watch as they perform menial tasks for masters they cannot even properly perceive. The Adeptus Mechanicus justifies servitorization through theological reasoning. They believe that servitors are in communion with the machine god, that the transformation represents a form of redemption for those who have sinned against the Omnissiah. By sacrificing their will and individuality, the sinners find salvation, their flesh and metal serving purposes greater than their individual desires ever could. This belief is almost certainly false comfort, a rationalization for what is essentially slavery with extra steps, but it serves the important function of making the tech priests feel better about what they create. The types of servitors are as varied as the tasks the Imperium requires them to perform. Gun servitors are equipped with heavy weapons and positioned as immobile defensive emplacements, their bodies serving as mounts for weapons that would normally require vehicles or tripods. Medical servitors assist in surgical procedures, their enhanced strength and programmed precision making them ideal for the repetitive tasks of battlefield medicine. Labor servitors perform the countless dangerous or monotonous jobs that keep Imperial infrastructure functioning, from cleaning toxic spills to loading cargo in void ship holds. Some servitors are created from particularly valuable source material. Space Marine servitors, for instance, are created from Astartes, who have committed such grievous crimes against their chapters that even execution would be too merciful. The transformation is a specific punishment used by chapters like the Iron Hands and their successors, who view the melding of flesh and machine as sacred. To be made a servitor is to be denied even the honor of dying in battle, to be reduced to a tool when you were once a warrior. The psychological impact on the Space Marine before the transformation must be devastating. They know what awaits them, understand that everything they are will be stripped away, and yet they cannot escape their fate. Archoflagellants represent a variation on servitorization that adds the element of conscious suffering. Unlike servitors, archoflagellants are not lobotomized. Instead, They are augmented with weapons in place of arms, fitted with chemical injectors that connect directly to their spines, and equipped with pacifier helmets that control their actions through crude mind impulse units. The helmet shows them serene, utopian visions when they are inactive, but when activated for combat, it switches to images of torture and violence, while the injectors flood their systems with combat stimulants. The result is a berserker weapon, a cyborg that retains just enough consciousness to suffer fully, but not enough control to resist its programming. Arcoflagellants are used by the Ecclesiarchy and the Ordo Hereticus as shock troops, hurled at enemy positions where they tear through anything in their path until finally destroyed. The process is considered redemptive, a way for heretics to atone for their sins through suffering and service. But the reality is simply that the Imperium has found yet another way to extract utility from the condemned. Penitent engines take this concept even further. These are large bipedal war machines with the penitent strapped to the front of the chassis, fully exposed to enemy fire. The penitent is hardwired into the machine through fiber optic neural connectors, their nervous system integrated with the engine's control systems. Unlike Space Marine dreadnoughts, which are fully enclosed and provide some protection to their pilots, penitent engines leave the condemned vulnerable, relying on the Emperor's judgment to keep them safe or take their life as he sees fit. The crimes that result in being bound to a penitent engine are so severe that imprisonment, exile, or even arcoflagellation are deemed insufficient. Punishment. Many of these penitents were once members of the Ecclesiarchy itself, priests who fell from the Emperor's grace or battle sisters who failed in their faith so catastrophically that death alone would not serve as sufficient atonement. The suffering involved is both physical and spiritual. The penitent, torn between the pain of their integration with the machine and the knowledge that only through death can they hope to earn the Emperor's forgiveness. From the perspective of the Mechanicus and the Ecclesiarchy, these various forms of servitorization serve multiple, valuable purposes. They provide labor and military capability while simultaneously disposing of criminals and heretics. They demonstrate the power of imperial justice and the terrible consequences of transgression. They even serve, in a twisted way, as sources of hope, showing that even the most grievous sins can theoretically be redeemed through sufficient suffering and service. But the underlying horror remains. These are human beings, or at least they were, transformed into things that serve purposes defined by others with no agency of their own. The servitor hauling crates in a warehouse might once have been a thief who stole food to feed his family. The gun servitor defending a Mechanicus facility might have been a tech adept who committed the crime of curiosity, asking questions about technology that the Omnissiah had not seen fit to reveal. The arcoflagellant tearing through enemy ranks might have been a priest whose interpretation of scripture differed too much from orthodoxy. The Imperium treats servitorization as a practical matter, a solution to both the problem of what to do with criminals and the need for expendable labor that won't rebel. But there are hints in the sources that even the Mechanicus understands there is something deeply wrong with the practice. Magi Psychana, with more heretical leanings, speak of servitors retaining their souls, even after their minds are destroyed, these souls suffering terribly as they witness their bodies performing tasks without their will. This is considered tech heresy to even discuss, but the fact that it is discussed at all suggests an undercurrent of unease. The question of consciousness in servitors remains one of the most disturbing elements of the practice. If a servitor truly has no awareness, then at least there is no suffering beyond the initial transformation. But if some fragment of consciousness remains, trapped inside a body it cannot control, forced to experience an existence reduced to simple programmed responses, then servitorization becomes perhaps the worst punishment the Imperium inflicts. It is exile from the self, from everything that makes existence meaningful. And unlike other forms of exile, there is no path back, no possibility of redemption or release, except through the servitor's eventual breakdown and destruction. The efficiency of the system ensures its continuation. The Imperium has an endless need for servitors and an endless supply of criminals to transform into them. The Mechanicus performs the transformations with the same clinical precision they apply to all their work, seeing flesh as just another material to be shaped and programmed. And the rest of the Imperium looks away, perhaps uncomfortable with what servitorization entails, but unwilling to question a system that produces such useful results. In this, we see the ultimate expression of the Imperium's utilitarian brutality. Every person is a resource to be exploited, and if they fail or transgress, they will be repurposed rather than simply discarded. The fact that this repurposing destroys the person they were is considered irrelevant. What matters is the function they can serve, the work they can perform, the value they can provide to the endless war effort. Servitorization is exile from humanity made manifest, and it is practiced on a scale that numbs the imagination. The long exile, 10,000 years in the eye of terror. While the Imperium exiles its own for punishment or expediency, the greatest exile in the history of humanity was not imposed by the Emperor, but earned through the greatest betrayal imaginable. When Horus fell to chaos, and nearly half the Space Marine legions followed him into damnation, the Siege of Terror ended with the traitors broken and fleeing into the Eye of Terror, that great wound in reality where the material universe and the warp bleed into each other. For 10,000 years, the traitor legions have endured their exile in that nightmare realm, and what they have become in that time reveals truths about exile that the loyalists would prefer not to acknowledge. The Eye of Terror is not a place in any conventional sense. It is a region of space where the barriers between reality and the immaterium have collapsed, where the laws of physics are suggestions rather than rules, where time flows in ways that defy comprehension. A day in the Eye might be a century outside it, or a millennium might pass within, while only moments elapse in the wider galaxy. The landscape shifts and changes according to the whims of the chaos gods. Solid matter flowing like water, impossible geometries making navigation an exercise in madness. For the traitor legions, this became home, not by choice, but because after their defeat at the Siege of Terror, there was nowhere else they could go. The Imperium they had sought to rule was closed to them, their former brothers hunting them with an intensity born of betrayal. The Eye offered sanctuary of a sort, a place where their corrupted forms were no anomaly but the norm, where the powers they had bargained with could protect them from imperial vengeance. The cost of this sanctuary has been steep. Within the Eye, mutation is not an aberration, but an inevitability. The chaos energies that permeate the region reshape flesh according to their own logic, granting terrible gifts and extracting terrible prices. Few of the original traitors remain unchanged. Their bodies are twisted into forms that sometimes barely resemble the Space Marines they once were. Horns sprout from helms fused to skulls, extra limbs grow from torsos, skin becomes scales, or chitin, or something that cannot be easily named. But the physical mutations are perhaps the least of what the Eye takes. The psychological transformation is more profound. 10,000 years of existence in a realm where reality is negotiable, where demons are neighbors and the gods themselves can reach down to reward or punish, has fundamentally altered how the traitors think and perceive. Many have lost all connection to their origins, their memories of the Great Crusade and the heresy fading into myth. They know only that they hate the Imperium and serve the dark gods, the reasons why long since lost to the slow erosion of sanity that the Eye inflicts. The traitor legions have fractured into countless warbands, each pursuing its own goals and serving its own masters. The sons of Horus renamed themselves the Black Legion, and under Abaddon the Despoiler have launched 13 Black Crusades against the Imperium, each one an attempt to finish what Horus started. The Emperor's children have descended so deeply into the worship of Slaanesh that they exist in a constant state of sensory overload, seeking ever more extreme experiences to feel anything at all. The Death Guard have embraced Nurgle's gifts of disease and decay, their bodies walking gardens of infection that spread plague wherever they go. The World Eaters lost themselves to Khorne's rage, their Primarch Angron elevated to demon princehood, while his sons degenerate into little more than rabid animals driven by the need to spill blood. The Thousand Sons sought to preserve their knowledge and magical power, but the rubric of Ahriman transformed most of them into animated suits of armor, soulless automatons controlled by the handful of sorcerers who survived, the ritual with their consciousness intact. Yet even within the Eye, even among the damned and corrupted, the concept of exile persists. Chaos Space Marines can fall from favor with their patrons, can be cast out from their warbands, can find themselves alone in a realm that is hostile even to those who serve its masters. These outcasts become pirates and scavengers, selling their services to whoever will have them, existing on the margins of a society that itself exists on the margins of reality. Arderic Varnis, whom Uriel Ventris encountered on Medrengard, exemplifies this type of exile. A former Raven Guard shadow captain, Varnis fled into the Eye rather than face execution by his chapter for crimes that are never fully detailed. In the Eye, he gathered around him other renegades, Space Marines who had similarly chosen exile over death. They scratched out an existence in the ruins left behind by the endless wars the traitor legions fight among themselves, scavenging for resources, and avoiding the attention of the more powerful warbands. Varns had not fully embraced chaos. He retained enough of his loyalty to the Emperor to refuse the Dark God's gifts, but he had lost all hope of ever returning to the Imperium. When Ventris appeared, driven by his death oath to destroy the Demoncolaba, Varnes saw in him both an opportunity and a fool. The opportunity was tactical. Ventris's quest aligned with Varnes's own desire to strike at Warsmith Honso, who ruled the fortress where both the Demoncolaba and valuable resources could be found. The fool was in Ventris's belief that redemption was possible, that completing his task would wash away his exile and allow him to return home. The alliance between Ventris and Varns highlights the different responses to exile that Space Marines can have. Ventris clung desperately to his purpose, believing that if he could just complete his task, he could reclaim everything he had lost. Varns had long since abandoned such hopes, accepting his exile as permanent and reshaping his identity around survival in the Eye. Both were exiles, but they had taken very different paths in response to that status. The Eye also attracts those who are exiled from the Imperium, but not yet fully committed to chaos. Renegade Space Marines, chapters, or parts of chapters, declared excommunicate traitoris for reasons that might not involve heresy, sometimes flee into the Eye as the only place they can survive. Some eventually succumb to chaos, the constant exposure and the desperation of their situation making the Dark God's offers of power increasingly attractive. Others manage to maintain their humanity, fighting against the corruption even as it slowly seeps into their souls. These renegades exist in a liminal state, neither fully loyal nor fully traitor. They might still believe they serve the Emperor, that the Imperium has become corrupt and they represent the true faith, or they might simply seek to survive, refusing to pledge themselves to chaos, but equally unwilling to surrender to an Imperium that will execute them for their past actions. They are the truly damned, caught between two terrible options and finding neither acceptable. The warbands that operate in the Eye have developed their own cultures and hierarchies over the millennia. Some maintain structures similar to the legions they once were, with lords and champions commanding warriors organized into companies and squads. Others have descended into pure might-makes-right anarchy, where the strongest rule until someone stronger comes along to depose them. Many warbands are led by demon princes, former Astartes elevated to immortal servitude by the Chaos Gods, their minds and bodies so thoroughly transformed that they bear little resemblance to what they once were. The competition for resources in the Eye is fierce. Gene seed is the most precious commodity, as it allows the warbands to create new Chaos Space Marines to replace losses, the Samamas. Traitor legions raid into Imperial space not just to spread destruction, but to capture loyalist space marines, whose gene seed can be harvested and corrupted for their own purposes. Slaves are another valuable resource, used for labor, sacrifice, or as raw material for the terrible experiments the Dark Mechanicum conducts. Weapons, armor, ships, all must be taken from somewhere, as the eye produces little on its own. The Demonculaba that Ventress was sent to destroy represented one attempt to solve the gene seed problem. By fusing human women with demon essence and implanting human captives within their wombs, warsmith Honsu had created a grotesque parody of the Space Marine creation process. Most of the results were the unfleshed, failed creations that retained their loyalty to the Emperor despite their monstrous forms. But enough succeeded to make the process worthwhile, at least until Ventress destroyed it. The psychological state of Chaos Space Marines in the Eye varies wildly. Some have embraced their damnation fully, reveling in the power and freedom that service to Chaos provides. They see their exile not as punishment, but as liberation, escape from the stifling dogma of the Imperium into a realm where they can pursue their desires without limit. Others are more bitter, their hatred of the Imperium fueled by the knowledge that they can never return, that they are forever marked as traitors, even if they came to Chaos through manipulation or desperation rather than choice. Many have simply gone mad. 10,000 years is a long time, even for a Space Marine's enhanced lifespan, and the Eye's corrupting influence makes sanity difficult to maintain. Some Chaos Space Marines exist in states of perpetual rage or despair, their higher functions burned away until only the most basic drives remain. Others have fragmented, their personalities splitting into multiple aspects that war for control of their bodies. A few have achieved a kind of enlightened madness, understanding that nothing they do matters in the cosmic scheme and finding perverse freedom in that knowledge. The traitor legions also maintain their hatred of the Imperium with an intensity that has not diminished over 10 millennia. Every Black Crusade, every raid, every moment of violence directed at the Emperor's domain is driven by this hatred. They remember the Siege of Terror, remember the moment when victory was snatched away by Horus's death at the Emperor's hands. They remember being driven from their own galaxy, forced to hide in this nightmare realm while the Imperium they sought to rule prospered without them. This hatred serves multiple purposes. It provides motivation, a reason to keep fighting despite the hopelessness of their situation. It offers a sense of identity, a way to maintain continuity with who they were before Chaos claimed them. And it justifies their actions, allowing them to frame their raiding and killing not as mere piracy, but as righteous vengeance against those who cast them out. Whether this hatred is genuine or a convenient fiction, they tell themselves is perhaps impossible to determine, as the line between the two has blurred over countless centuries. The Eye of Terror represents exile at its most absolute and its most strange. The traitor legions cannot return to the Imperium, cannot reclaim their positions as the Emperor's favored sons, but they have built something in their exile, an empire of sorts, twisted and terrible, but undeniably powerful. They have survived where survival should be impossible, adapted to conditions that would break lesser beings, and emerged as threats capable of challenging the Imperium itself. In this sense, their exile has failed in its purpose. They were driven into the Eye to be destroyed, to wither away into nothing. Instead, they have festered and grown, their power waxing rather than waning. The Imperium's attempts to contain them through the Cadian Gate and other strategic positions have proven insufficient. The Black Crusades keep coming, each one threatening to tear open the galaxy and allow the forces of chaos to pour through. The traitor legion's exile has transformed them, but it has not destroyed them. They remain a constant threat, a reminder that the Emperor's greatest triumph contains within it the seeds of his greatest failure. And as the 42nd millennium dawns with the opening of the Great Rift, Their exile seems less like permanent banishment and more like a long preparation for a war that is only now truly beginning. Between loyalty and damnation, the renegade Space Marines. Not all Space Marines who turn against the Imperium do so in service to chaos. Some are declared excommunicate traitorous for reasons that have nothing to do with heresy, cast out from the Emperor's light due to political maneuvering, honest mistakes, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. These renegades exist in a grey zone between the loyal chapters and the traitor, legions, and their exile is perhaps more tragic for being undeserved. The Badab War provides the most comprehensive example of how entire chapters can be driven into exile without ever intending to betray the Emperor. The conflict began when Luft Huron, chapter master of the Astral Claws, refused to surrender control of the Badab sector to the Imperium's tax collectors. From Huron's perspective, this was not rebellion but pragmatic governance. The sector's resources were needed to fund the defense against pirate raids and Xenos incursions, and sending them to Terra would leave the population unprotected. The Imperium saw things differently. Huron's refusal to pay tithes was insubordination, and insubordination from a Space Marine chapter master could not be tolerated. The situation escalated. Other chapters were drawn into the conflict, and what began as a tax dispute metastasized into a full-scale civil war that would last for a decade and consume several chapters entirely. When the Astral Claws finally lost, when their fortress monastery was destroyed and their numbers decimated, Huron and his remaining warriors had nowhere to go. They had fought against the Imperium, killed other loyalist Space Marines, and could expect no mercy from the victor. Their only option was to flee into the Maelstrom, a warp storm similar to the Eye of Terror, where they could rebuild away from Imperial jurisdiction. In the Maelstrom, they renamed themselves the Red Corsairs and began the descent into chaos that would eventually see Huron transformed into the Demon Prince, known as Huron Blackheart. The tragedy of the Astral Claws is that their fall was not inevitable. Huron had not sought to betray the Emperor. He simply believed he knew better how to serve than the distant bureaucrats of Terra. But the Imperium cannot tolerate such independence, cannot allow even well-intentioned deviation from its dictates. The result was that a chapter which had served loyally for thousands of years was destroyed, its survivors forced into exile, where chaos could corrupt them. Other chapters have found themselves declared excommunicate traitoris for equally dubious reasons. The Soul Drinkers, for instance, were condemned after they came into possession of a suit of armor that the Adeptus Mechanicus wanted recovered. The chapter's refusal to surrender the armor led to conflict with both the Mechanicus and eventually the Inquisition, even though the Soul Drinkers continued to fight against chaos and Xenos threats throughout their exile. They maintained their loyalty to the Emperor, even as the Imperium they served hunted them as traitors. These renegades face a unique form of exile. Unlike the traitor legions, they have not fully embraced chaos and may actively resist corruption. But unlike loyal chapters operating within Imperial jurisdiction, they have no support network, no supply lines, no safe haven where they can recruit and rearm. They must scavenge for resources, making deals with rogue traders or raiding Imperial installations to acquire what they need. Some turn to piracy, attacking merchant vessels and extracting protection fees from worlds that would otherwise report them to the authorities. The psychological burden of this existence is immense. These Space Marines still believe they serve the Emperor, still pray to him, and follow the teachings of their primarchs as best they can. But they are hunted by those who should be their brothers, forced to fight and kill other loyalists simply to survive. Every engagement against Imperial forces reinforces their exile, pushes them further from any hope of redemption. And always there is the temptation of chaos, whispering that if the Imperium will not accept their service, perhaps the Dark Gods will. The fall rate among renegades is high. Most eventually succumb to chaos, whether through deliberate choice or gradual corruption. The constant exposure to the warp during space travel without proper Geller field maintenance, The desperate deals made with demonic entities for information or power, the slow erosion of faith as the Emperor seemingly abandons those who still worship him, all combine to push renegades toward damnation. Within a few centuries, most renegade chapters have either been destroyed, absorbed into the traitor legions, or transformed into chaos warband indistinguishable from those who followed Horus. Yet a few resist. The Carcharodon Astra, often called the Space Sharks, operate on the fringes of known space, conducting long-range patrols that keep them away from the Imperium for decades or centuries at a time. They are not officially renegades, but their independence and refusal to fully integrate with the broader Imperial structure makes them suspect. They maintain their loyalty through strict discipline and an almost fanatical dedication to their mission, but they are feared by other chapters and avoided by Imperial authorities who are never quite sure what to make of them. The Carcharodons even have their own version of exile within exile, the Void Exiles. These are battle brothers who have committed some dishonor against the chapter's codes and are stripped of their names and sent on the most dangerous missions with little support. They are the Carcharodons made miniature, exiled from their companies while still serving the chapter, their minds wiped between missions and stored in stasis when not needed. It is a punishment that echoes the servitor's fate, while stopping just short of full lobotomization, a way to extract service while still inflicting meaningful suffering. The existence of renegade chapters poses uncomfortable questions for the Imperium's narrative of absolute loyalty. If entire chapters of the Emperor's finest warriors can be driven into exile without ever intending to betray him, what does that say about the Imperium's justice? If warriors who still pray to the Emperor and fight his enemies must be hunted as traitors because they refused an unjust order or made a bureaucrat angry, how can the Imperium claim moral authority? The answer, of course, is that the Imperium does not concern itself with such questions. Justice in the 41st millennium is not about fairness or rehabilitation, but about maintaining control. A Space Marine chapter that acts independently is a threat regardless of its intentions, because it demonstrates that the Imperium's control is not absolute. Better to destroy a potentially loyal chapter than risk it becoming a rallying point for others who might question Imperial authority. For the renegades themselves, exile means living in constant tension between past and future, between what they were and what they are becoming. They cling to their old identities, maintaining chapter traditions and honoring their primarchs, even as these practices ring increasingly hollow. They tell themselves that they remain loyal, that their war against the Imperium is a tragic misunderstanding that will eventually be resolved. But as years turn to decades and decades to centuries, this hope fades, replaced by bitterness and the slow acceptance that they are truly alone. Some renegades attempt to find redemption through extreme acts of service. They throw themselves at the Imperium's worst enemies, fighting tyrannid hive fleets or chaos incursions without support, hoping that if they can prove their loyalty through deeds, they might be forgiven. These efforts almost always fail. The Imperium rarely learns of such actions, and when it does, it assumes the renegades are simply trying to lure loyal forces into a trap. Dead renegades are the only truly trusted renegades. Others abandon hope of redemption and instead focus on survival and the protection of humanity, even if that humanity has rejected them. They become mercenaries or defenders of frontier worlds that the Imperium has abandoned, fighting not for the Emperor's glory, but for the simple satisfaction of doing what they were created to do, wage war against mankind's enemies. It is a hollow existence, but it has a certain purity to it, a return to fundamental purpose stripped of all the ceremony and dogma that normally surrounds Space Marine service. The few renegades who manage to achieve some form of peace often do so by abandoning their old identities entirely. They remake themselves as something new, founding their own micro-empires on forgotten worlds or in the void between systems. They recruit new warriors not through the traditional Space Marine methods, but through whatever means are available, creating forces that are part Space Marine, part pirate crew, part cult of personality. These entities exist in the cracks of imperial control, too small to draw serious attention, but large enough to defend themselves against casual threats. Throughout all of this, the specter of chaos looms. Every renegade knows that the dark gods watch them, waiting for the moment when desperation, or rage, or simple exhaustion makes them vulnerable to corruption. Some actively resist, developing rituals and practices designed to ward off demonic influence. Others take a more pragmatic approach, making limited deals with chaos entities while trying to avoid deeper entanglement. A few simply don't care anymore, accepting corruption as the price of survival and telling themselves that at least they're still fighting, even if the cause has changed. The renegade Space Marines represent exile at its most ambiguous. They are neither fully loyal nor fully traitor, neither innocent nor entirely guilty. They exist in the spaces between the Imperium's absolutes, and in doing so, they reveal the cracks in a system that insists everything must be either pure or corrupt with no middle ground. Their tragedy is that they prove the middle ground can exist, but the Imperium's response is to eliminate it rather than acknowledge it. The weight of dishonor, psychological realities of exile. Beneath all the mechanics of exile, the explosive collars and mind wipes and impossible quests, lies the human experience of being cast out. To understand what exile means in Warhammer 40,000, we must look beyond the physical circumstances and examine the psychological and spiritual wounds it inflicts. In a galaxy where identity is so often defined by one's place in the Emperor's grand design, to lose that place is to lose the very foundation of self. For a Space Marine, the chapter is not merely an organization, but the central pillar of existence. From the moment an aspirant is selected, usually in early adolescence, his entire life is oriented around becoming a worthy son of his Primarch and brother to the warriors who came before him. The years of training, the surgical enhancement, the psycho-conditioning, all serve to remake the individual into something greater, but in the process, they also create dependencies that run deeper than mere habit or preference. The Brotherhood of A chapter provides not just companionship, but a framework for understanding the universe. The chapter's teachings explain why the universe is the way it is, what threats must be faced, how a warrior should conduct himself in all circumstances. The Battle Brothers are not friends in any casual sense, but fellow travelers on a path that leads toward apotheosis through service. To be exiled from this structure is to have the map ripped away mid-journey, to be left alone to navigate without the landmarks that once made sense of chaos. The immediate psychological impact is often described in terms of profound loss, similar to bereavement, but more totalizing. The exile has not lost a person, but an entire world, a context within which he understood himself and his purpose. Everything he does now lacks the validation that his brothers once provided, the certainty that his actions serve the larger mission. He must make decisions without the chaplain's guidance, fight without the support of his brothers, and face the universe's horrors without the comfort of belonging to something greater than himself. This loss of context frequently manifests as a crisis of identity. The Space Marine looks at himself and asks, "What am I now?" He was a battle brother of his chapter, a warrior in service to the Emperor, a link in the great chain that connects the present to the Primarch's legacy and the Emperor's grand design. But in exile, these definitions fail. He is still a warrior, still possesses all his training and enhancements. But to what end? For what cause? The answers that once seemed self-evident now require conscious construction, and many exiles find themselves unable to perform that construction. Some respond to this crisis by clinging even more desperately to their old identity. They continue to perform the rituals of their chapter, recite the prayers, maintain the traditions exactly as they remember them. This can provide stability, a way to carry the chapter with them, even in exile, but it can also become pathological. a refusal to adapt to new circumstances that leaves the exile trapped in a simulation of a brotherhood that no longer exists for him. Others attempt to construct new identities, to define themselves through their quest for redemption or their survival in hostile conditions. Uriel Ventris provides an example of this approach. During his exile, he defined himself through his death oath, making the completion of his task the central organizing principle of his existence. Everything he did was evaluated against whether it brought him closer to destroying the Demoncolaba and earning his return to the Ultramarines. This gave him purpose and direction, but it also meant that failure would have left him with nothing, no backup identity to fall back on if his quest proved impossible. The psychological burden is intensified by the loneliness of exile. Space Marines are created to function within the context of their chapters, to operate as part of a coordinated whole. While they can certainly fight alone when necessary, prolonged isolation goes against their fundamental nature. They are enhanced humans, not solitary predators, and the lack of their brother's presence creates a void that cannot easily be filled. This loneliness manifests in various ways. Some exiles become obsessively focused on their missions, driving themselves to extremes of effort and risk because they have nothing else to occupy their thoughts. Others develop parasocial relationships with figures from their past, having conversations with battle brothers who are not present, seeking guidance from dead chaplains or primarchs who exist only in memory. A few descend into madness, their enhanced brains unable to process the cognitive dissonance between what they were created to be and what they have become. The exile must also grapple with the knowledge that his name has been stricken from the chapter's records. He is not merely absent, but erased, his deeds unrecorded, his existence unacknowledged. For warriors whose culture emphasizes honor and glory, this erasure cuts deep. It means that everything he accomplished before his exile might as well not have happened, that the brothers he saved and the enemies he slew have been rendered meaningless by his subsequent failure. This creates a powerful motivation to succeed in the death oath or similar quest. Success means not just return, but restoration, the chance to have his name restored and his past deeds recognized once more. But it also means that every moment of exile reinforces his worthlessness in the eyes of those he cares about most. He is a ghost, and only by completing the impossible can he become real again. For those in penal legions, the psychological impact is different, but no less severe. These are not enhanced warriors clinging to brotherhood, but ordinary humans stripped of their military honors and identities. The explosive collar serves as a constant physical reminder of their status, impossible to ignore or forget. Every swallow, every turn of the head brings awareness of the device that could end their life in an instant, if those in authority deem it appropriate. The penal legionnaire lives with the knowledge that his death is expected, even desired. He is not being given a chance to redeem himself so much as being used up, his life spent to purchase tactical advantages or test enemy defenses. The missions he is sent on are suicidal by design, and survival is more accident than intent. This creates a psychology of fatalism, an acceptance that death is not just possible, but inevitable, the only question being when and how. Some legionnaires cope by becoming reckless, charging into danger with abandon because they reason that death will come, regardless of their actions. Others become calculating, trying to position themselves to survive each mission in the hope that if they can just last long enough, they might earn redemption. Both approaches are usually futile. The penal legions are designed to kill their members, and individual skill or luck can only delay the inevitable for so long. The psychological state of servitors is perhaps the most horrifying to contemplate precisely because it is so uncertain. If a servitor truly has no consciousness, then there is no psychological experience to examine, just the mechanical performance of programmed tasks. But if some fragment of awareness remains, if the person they once were still exists in some truncated form within the lobotomized brain, then what must that existence be like? The sources that suggest servitors retain consciousness describe a state of perpetual helplessness, awareness without agency. The servitor might understand what is happening to them, might even remember who they were before, but they cannot act on this knowledge. They are prisoners in their own bodies, forced to watch as they perform tasks they would never choose, serve masters they might despise, exist in a state that their pre-servitor self would consider worse than death. This is exile from the self made literal. The person has not been sent away from a place, but from their own identity, their ability to make choices, their capacity to be anything other than what they have been programmed to be. It is a death that leaves the body animate, a destruction so complete that it paradoxically preserves just enough awareness to appreciate what has been destroyed. For all forms of exile, there is also the spiritual dimension to consider. The Imperium is not just a political entity, but a faith, and to be cast out from it is to be separated from the Emperor's light. This is not merely metaphorical. Many in the Imperium genuinely believe that the Emperor watches over and protects the faithful, that to lose his favor is to be exposed to spiritual dangers that could corrupt or destroy the soul. The exile must grapple with the question of whether the Emperor has abandoned them, or whether their exile is itself a test, a trial that the Emperor has set to prove their worth. This uncertainty can be psychologically devastating, as it means the exile cannot even be certain whether their suffering has meaning. Are they being purified through their trials, or simply cast aside as unworthy? The answer might determine whether they have any hope of redemption, or are simply waiting for death in a universe that no longer cares about them. Religious faith becomes both a comfort and a torment in exile. Those who maintain their belief in the Emperor can draw strength from it, finding purpose in the idea that they still serve, even if their service is no longer recognized. But this same faith can also amplify their suffering, as they must reconcile their exile with their belief in a benevolent deity. Why would the Emperor allow this to happen to those who served him? What sin could be so great that it merits such punishment? The answers to these questions are rarely satisfying, and many exiles find their faith tested in ways that their previous existence within the Imperium never prepared them for. Throughout all of this, the exile must also navigate the practical challenges of survival in a galaxy that is hostile even to those who belong. Without the support structures provided by membership in the Imperium, every aspect of existence becomes more difficult. Food, water, ammunition, medical care, all must be acquired through barter, theft, or improvisation. The exile cannot simply requisition supplies from Imperial depots or expect aid from fellow servants of the Emperor. They are on their own, and the galaxy cares nothing for their struggles. This practical isolation reinforces the psychological isolation, creating a feedback loop of marginalization. The exile is alone because they have been cast out, and their isolation makes them more vulnerable, which in turn makes them more desperate, which can lead to choices that further distance them from any hope of return. It is a downward spiral that few escape, and those who do often emerge so changed that the question of whether they have truly returned becomes meaningless. The psychological reality of exile in Warhammer 40,000 is one of profound dislocation and existential uncertainty. The exile has lost not just a home, but the framework that made sense of existence, not just companions, but the very community that validated their identity. They must remake themselves in conditions that are actively hostile to such remaking, must find meaning in a universe that insists they are meaningless, must somehow maintain hope in the face of almost certain doom. That any succeed at all is testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even when that spirit has been enhanced, corrupted, or traumatized beyond recognition. The exile's struggle is not merely physical, but spiritual and psychological. A battle fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. And in this struggle, we see reflected the broader human condition in Warhammer 40,000. A constant fight against forces that seek to destroy, degrade, and damify, with only the slimmest hope that something of value might be preserved through the ordeal. Redemption earned in blood, the paths back from exile. While exile in Warhammer 40,000 is designed to be permanent or terminal, the Imperium's theology demands that redemption remain theoretically possible. The Emperor's mercy must be infinite, even if its practical expression is vanishingly rare. This contradiction creates the possibility of return from exile, paths back from banishment that are so difficult as to be almost mythical, yet real enough that their existence shapes how the exiled approach their punishment. For Space Marines under death oaths, the path to redemption is clearly defined, even if its completion is nearly impossible. The exile must complete the task set before him by his chapter master, and he must do so without falling to corruption or heresy. This seems simple, but the tasks assigned are specifically chosen to be almost certainly lethal. Venture into the Eye of Terror and destroy a chaos stronghold. Hunt down a demon prince and banish it back to the warp. Recover a lost relic from a tomb world infested with necrons. These are not missions that Space Marines are expected to survive. They are elaborate executions dressed up as opportunities for glory. Yet some do survive, and their success transforms them. Uriel Ventris returned from his death oath not just restored to his position, but elevated in the eyes of his brothers. He had walked through the Eye of Terror, the heart of chaos itself, and emerged uncorrupted. He had destroyed the Demoncolaba and rescued the unfleshed, proving that even in the darkest places, the Emperor's light could shine. The testing he underwent upon his return, the examinations by Grey Knights and chaplains and apothecaries, confirmed that he had achieved what should have been impossible. This return was not simply a matter of being forgiven. Ventris had to prove that he had been purified by his ordeal, that the person who returned was worthy of the honors that the person who left had lost. The death oath functioned as a crucible, burning away whatever weakness or pride had led to his initial failure and tempering what remained into something stronger. The Ultramarines who welcomed him back were not merely accepting a penitent, but celebrating a warrior who had been tested beyond normal limits and found true. The White Scars Sagya Mazan tradition allows for similar redemption, though with more flexibility in how it is achieved. The exiled warrior chooses his own path, his own enemies to defeat, his own way to wash away dishonor. This means that success is defined not by completing a specific task, but by dying honorably in battle against the enemies of mankind. For those who survive such death-seeking long enough, their continued existence becomes its own form of proof that the Khan still watches over them, that they retain value despite their exile. Some Sagya Mazan warriors have their exile lifted after particularly spectacular victories, or after they have served long enough that their original transgression seems trivial compared to their subsequent service. Others are never formally restored, but simply reintegrated through the quiet acknowledgement of their brothers, their exile ending not with ceremony, but with the gradual acceptance that they have suffered enough. This approach recognizes that redemption is not always a dramatic moment, but sometimes a slow process of rebuilding trust and identity. For penal legionnaires, the path to redemption is even more uncertain. Imperial doctrine teaches that those who serve in the penal legions can earn the Emperor's pardon through sufficient bloodshed and sacrifice, but the criteria for sufficient are never clearly defined. In practice, most legionnaires serve until they are killed, their pardons granted posthumously by commanders who take it upon themselves to declare the condemned redeemed in death. The few who survive long enough and fight well enough to earn actual pardons while still living emerge as something barely recognizable as human. Lieutenant Cage's story illustrates this transformation. After surviving the destruction of Corritanorum and earning his pardon, he should have been free to return to normal guard service. Instead, he found that the scars of his time in the Last Chances ran too deep, his personal demons driving him to murder again and returning him to penal service. Even redemption could not undo what the penal legion had made of him. Those who do successfully transition out of the penal legions often struggle to reintegrate into normal military or civilian life. They have become accustomed to explosive collars and suicide missions, to expecting death at any moment and trusting no one. The ordinary disciplines and hierarchies of the imperial, guard or civilian society seem simultaneously too rigid and too lax, failing to provide either the structure of their previous lives or the brutal simplicity of the penal legion. Many drift back toward military service, volunteering for dangerous assignments or joining mercenary companies where their skills and mindset are valued. For servitors and other forms of mind-wiped exile, redemption in any meaningful sense is impossible. Once the brain has been lobotomized and the consciousness destroyed or reduced to fragments, there is no person left to redeem. The servitor performs its functions until it breaks down, and that is the end. Rarely, very rarely, something might happen to partially restore a servitor's consciousness. Fragments of personality resurfacing through trauma or malfunction. But this is not redemption, but a new horror, as the person trapped in the servitor form realizes what has been done to them. The one exception to this absolute is found in cases where the servitorization process was incomplete or reversible. During the Great Crusade, there is at least one recorded instance of Perturabo, Primarch of the Iron Warriors, witnessing something that reversed a servitor's transformation, restoring the person within. Such occurrences are so rare as to be effectively legendary, and they certainly cannot be relied upon as paths to redemption. For all practical purposes, servitorization is permanent and final. Renegade Space Marines face perhaps the most complex path to redemption because their exile was often not earned through clear transgression, but imposed through political or military defeat. The Imperium has declared them traitors, but they do not necessarily accept this judgment. How can they seek redemption for sins they do not believe they committed? How can they return to an Imperium that has already rejected them? Some renegades attempt to earn their way back through extreme acts of loyalty, throwing themselves at the Imperium's enemies with such fervor that surely their faithfulness cannot be questioned. They seek out the most dangerous threats, fighting tyrannid hive fleets, or chaos incursions without support or hope of reward, banking everything on the possibility that someone in authority will notice and recognize their continued service. This almost never works. The Imperium either does not learn of these actions, or assumes they are elaborate traps, or simply does not care, because dead renegades are preferable to forgiven ones. Others attempt more direct approaches, surrendering to imperial authorities and begging for a chance to prove their loyalty. This is even more dangerous than fighting, as it puts the renegades at the mercy of an Imperium that has already judged them traitor. Most such surrenders end in execution, the renegades killed out of hand or turned over to the Inquisition for extended interrogation before their eventual death. On rare occasions, individual renegades have been accepted into the Death Watch or Inquisitorial Service, their past crimes overlooked in exchange for useful skills or knowledge. But this is redemption only in the narrowest sense, as they can never return to their chapters or reclaim their former positions. The psychological dimension of redemption cannot be overlooked. Even for those who manage to return from exile, the experience changes them in ways that can never be fully undone. Uriel Ventris carried the memories of the Eye of Terror with him always, nightmares of what he had seen and done during his death oath. The penal legionnaires who earn pardons remain marked by their time in the collars, jumping at sudden sounds, expecting death at every moment. The renegades who find their way into the Death Watch or other service never truly escape the knowledge that they are only one mistake away from being cast out again. This raises the question of whether true redemption is even possible in the universe of Warhammer 40,000. Can the exile ever fully reclaim what was lost? Or is there always a scar, a mark that identifies them as different from those who never fell? The answer seems to be that redemption in the Imperium is less about restoration of the original state and more about transformation into something new. The exile who returns is not the same person who left. They have been through trials that fundamentally altered them, and the question is whether the Imperium values what they have become. In many cases, the redeemed exile becomes more valuable precisely because of their ordeal. They have seen and survived things that their brothers have not, gained knowledge that can only be acquired through suffering. Ventress's experience in the Eye of Terror made him a more effective commander when facing chaos threats, because he understood his enemies in ways that those who had only fought them from the outside could not. The penal legionnaires who survive bring with them a ruthlessness and disregard for personal safety that can be channeled into particular roles within the Guard. Yet this increased value comes at a cost. The redeemed exile can never be fully trusted again, never be seen as entirely pure. There is always the suspicion that their time away has corrupted them in ways too subtle to detect, that they are sleeper agents of chaos, or simply broken in ways that might manifest at critical moments. This suspicion means that even redeemed exiles often find themselves assigned to positions where failure or betrayal would be contained, never again given the full trust and authority they might have enjoyed before their exile. The path to redemption also serves an important function within the Imperium's broader system of control and motivation. By making redemption theoretically possible, but practically almost unattainable, the Imperium ensures that those who are exiled will continue to serve, rather than simply giving up or turning to the enemy. The Death Oath keeps the failed Space Marine fighting. The hope of pardon keeps the penal legionnaire charging into enemy fire. The possibility of return keeps the renegade searching for ways to prove their loyalty. If exile were truly permanent, with no possibility of redemption, the exiled might have nothing to lose by fully embracing their status as outcasts. They might turn to chaos, not because they desire corruption, but because the dark gods at least offer power and purpose, while the Emperor offers only condemnation. By maintaining the fiction that redemption is possible, the Imperium keeps even its exiles working toward imperial goals, extracting utility from them until the very end. The stories of successful redemptions are carefully recorded and propagated throughout the Imperium's military forces. They serve as examples of what can be achieved through faith and perseverance, proof that the Emperor's mercy extends even to those who have fallen. These stories inspire others to strive toward redemption, to believe that their own exile might be temporary if only they prove themselves worthy. But the reality is that for every Uriel Ventress who returns triumphant, there are thousands of unnamed exiles who die in obscurity, their quests unfulfilled, their sacrifices unrecorded. The successful redemptions are the exceptions that prove the rule, and the rule is that exile in Warhammer 40,000 is almost always permanent and almost always ends in death. Redemption is the carrot that keeps the exile moving forward, but the stick of almost certain doom is what truly defines their existence. Beyond the Emperor's reach. Exile in the void. Not all exile is imposed by imperial authority. Some choose banishment, fleeing into the spaces between stars where the Imperium's control does not reach. Others find themselves marooned or lost, cut off from the Emperor's domain through accident or misfortune rather than judgment. These exiles exist in a different category from those discussed previously, defined not by what they have lost, but by where they now exist. Beyond the Emperor's light, in the vast and largely unknown regions that surround and interpenetrate the Imperium. The galaxy is far larger than the Imperium's million worlds. Between the settled systems lie vast gulfs of space containing uncatalogued stars, rogue planets, and regions that have never known human presence. These interstitial spaces are dangerous, lacking the infrastructure and support that make life in the Imperium possible, but they also offer a kind of freedom that exists nowhere within the Emperor's domain. Here, the Adeptus Arbites do not enforce imperial law, the Administratum does not collect tithes, and the Inquisition does not hunt for heresy. Here, those who have fled imperial justice can sometimes carve out new existences, though rarely for long. Pirates and raiders constitute perhaps the largest population of voluntary exiles. These are individuals, or even entire crews, who have abandoned imperial service to prey upon shipping lanes and frontier colonies. Some are former Navy personnel who turned to piracy after their ships were decommissioned or destroyed, using their military training to become successful criminals. Others are renegade guard regiments, or even Space Marine warbands who have decided that raiding is more profitable than serving. The life of a pirate in Warhammer 40,000 is far from the romanticized version found in other settings. These are not swashbuckling heroes, but desperate criminals operating in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. Every voyage through the warp risks demonic incursion, or getting lost in the Imperium for subjective centuries. Every raid risks running into Imperial Navy patrols or Space Marine rapid response forces. The resources needed to maintain a void-capable ship are substantial, and pirates must constantly balance the need to acquire these resources through raiding against the increased attention that successful raids attract. Yet piracy persists because it offers an escape from the Imperium's grinding tyranny. A successful pirate crew can live on their own terms, making their own decisions about where to go and what to do. They answer to no one but their captain, and even that authority is usually based on competence and respect rather than the absolute hierarchies that define imperial service. For those who find the Imperium's structure too constraining, this freedom is worth the constant danger. Many pirate crews are made up of exiles from the Imperium, individuals who fled rather than face punishment for their crimes. These crews become floating communities of the outcast, bound together by their shared status as enemies of the Emperor's domain. They develop their own cultures and traditions, often borrowing from multiple sources as crew members from different worlds and backgrounds contribute their own practices. Some crews become quite sophisticated, operating almost like mobile trading companies that occasionally engage in violence, while others are barely organized mobs held together by fear and greed. The relationship between pirates and the Imperium is complex. While officially the Imperium considers all piracy to be criminal activity, warranting the harshest punishment, in practice, many imperial authorities tolerate or even secretly support certain pirate operations. Rogue traders, for instance, are given warrants that allow them to operate outside normal imperial law, and the line between a rogue trader and a pirate can be very thin. Some inquisitors maintain relationships with pirate crews, using them for operations that need to be deniable or that require knowledge of regions beyond imperial space. Other forms of exile beyond the Imperium's reach include those who are simply lost. Warp travel is inherently unpredictable, and ships sometimes emerge from the Imperium far from their intended destinations, or hundreds of years later than planned. The crews of such ships find themselves in regions of space they do not recognize, their homeworlds possibly destroyed or transformed beyond recognition during their time in the warp. These accidental exiles must choose between attempting the dangerous journey back to known space or establishing themselves wherever they have emerged. Some lost ships have founded new colonies on previously uninhabited worlds, their crews and passengers becoming the ancestors of populations that will eventually be rediscovered by the Imperium and absorbed into it. Others have less pleasant fates, their supplies running low as they search desperately for a habitable world or a way back home, their crews eventually dying or descending into cannibalism and madness. The void is littered with derelict ships that contain the mummified or skeletal remains of crews who got lost and never found their way home. There are also those who choose exile to pursue goals that the Imperium would not permit. Radical inquisitors who have been declared excommunicate traitoris sometimes flee into the darkness beyond the Imperium's borders, taking their retinues with them to continue their work unhindered by orthodox restrictions. They might establish themselves on frontier worlds or aboard space hulks, building new power bases from which they can pursue their investigations or experiments. These exiled inquisitors represent a particular danger because they retain much of their training and resources while no longer being constrained by even the loose oversight that the Inquisition provides. They might make pacts with Xenos or delve into forbidden lore without the counterbalancing influence of peers who might question their methods. Some eventually fall to chaos, their radical approaches leading them down paths they cannot return from. Others maintain their essential humanity and loyalty to the Emperor's ideals, if not to the Imperium itself, operating as independent agents who fight humanity's enemies without official sanction. The Eastern Fringe and other frontier regions contain numerous examples of exiled humans who have established themselves outside Imperial control. Some of these populations are descendants of colonies founded during the Great Crusade, or earlier that were cut off from Terra during the Age of Strife and never fully reintegrated. Others are more recent exiles, fleeing Imperial oppression, or simply seeking opportunities that the rigid hierarchies of the Imperium do not allow. These frontier communities live precarious existences. Without the Imperium's military protection, they are vulnerable to Xenos raids, pirate attacks, and the myriad other dangers that the galaxy offers. Some make alliances with Xenos species like the Tau, trading their humanity for protection and prosperity. Others develop their own defense forces, militias that fight with a desperation born of knowing that help will not come if they fail. A few thrive through a combination of luck, skill, and isolation, building societies that function surprisingly well, despite lacking the Imperium's support. The Imperium's response to these frontier communities varies. Some are left alone, considered too insignificant to be worth the effort of bringing back into compliance. Others are targeted for recovery, Imperial forces arriving to liberate populations who may not have wanted or needed liberation. The most dangerous frontier communities, particularly those that have allied with Xenos or shown signs of chaos corruption, are subjected to exterminatus, their entire worlds destroyed to prevent the spread of contamination. From the perspective of those living in these exiled communities, the Imperium is often the primary threat rather than a potential savior. They have built lives outside its reach, and the Imperium's arrival means destruction of whatever independence they have achieved. Some fight desperately to maintain their autonomy, using guerrilla tactics and knowledge of local conditions to resist Imperial forces that are more powerful but less familiar with the terrain. Others attempt to negotiate, offering tribute or allegiance in exchange for being allowed to continue their own governance with minimal Imperial interference. The Void itself can serve as a form of exile for certain categories of outcasts. Space hulks, those massive conglomerations of ships that have been fused together by warp energies. Sometimes house communities of exiles who have nowhere else to go. These populations live in the labyrinthine corridors of the hulks, scavenging technology from the merged ships and defending their territories against the various horrors that also inhabit these spaces. Life on a space hulk is brutally difficult, but it offers the possibility of survival for those who would be executed if they returned to Imperial space. Some space hulk communities develop sophisticated societies, complete with hierarchies, economies, and cultural practices that define them as distinct from both the Imperium and the Xenos species they might encounter. Others are little more than collections of individuals who happen to share space, each one isolated in their own madness or despair. The hulks drift through both real space and the warp, sometimes emerging near inhabited systems where they might be boarded by salvage crews or military forces, other times spending millennia in the void with no contact with the outside universe. Throughout all these forms of exile beyond the Imperium's reach runs a common thread: freedom purchased at the cost of security. Those who live outside Imperial control are not bound by its oppressive laws and hierarchies, but neither are they protected by its military might or supported by its infrastructure. They must provide for themselves, defend themselves, and navigate a galaxy that is hostile to human life, without the collective power that the Imperium offers. Some find this trade worthwhile, preferring the dangers of independence to the certainties of oppression. Others come to regret their exile, longing for the stability and structure they fled from, but unable to return without facing punishment for their departure. And many simply adapt, accepting their exiled status as permanent and building new identities around it, becoming something neither fully imperial nor entirely separate from the civilization that produced them. The existence of these exiles beyond the Imperium's reach reveals the limits of imperial power. Despite its claims to rule a million worlds and command the loyalty of all humanity, the Imperium's control is far from absolute. Vast regions of space remain unmapped, countless human populations live outside its oversight, and even within nominally imperial space, there are countless pockets where imperial authority is theoretical rather than real. The exiles who inhabit these spaces serve as reminders that the Emperor's domain, vast though it is, represents only a fraction of the galaxy and an even far smaller fraction of humanity's potential. Conclusion: the price of failure in the grim darkness. Exile in Warhammer 40,000 exists as a spectrum of punishments and conditions that all share a common element: removal from the structure and certainty of one's previous existence. Whether it is the Space Marine stripped of his chapter colors and sent on a death oath, the guard soldier fitted with an explosive collar and hurled at enemy positions, the criminal lobotomized and transformed into a servitor, or the renegade fleeing into the darkness beyond the Imperium's borders, all share the experience of losing their place in the Emperor's design and must somehow construct meaning from the ruins of their former lives. The Imperium's approach to exile reveals its fundamental nature as a civilization built on brutal efficiency and the ruthless exploitation of human resources. Every form of exile serves multiple purposes: punishment for transgression, extraction of continued service from the failed, deterrent to prevent others from similar failures, and ultimately the disposal of those deemed no longer worthy of their original positions. The condemned are squeezed for every drop of utility before finally being discarded, and even their suffering serves the purpose of reinforcing the system that created them. Yet within this bleak framework, there persist traces of something that might be called hope, or at least the memory of it. The Death Oath offers the possibility of redemption, however slim. The penal legions teach that service can lead to the Emperor's pardon, even if that pardon usually comes posthumously. The frontier communities beyond imperial space demonstrate that humans can survive and even thrive outside the system. That exile from the Imperium is not necessarily exile from meaning or purpose. These traces of hope are carefully cultivated by the Imperium because they serve its interests. The exile who believes redemption is possible will continue to fight and serve, while the exile who has given up all hope might turn to chaos or simply abandon the struggle. By maintaining the fiction that return is achievable, the Imperium ensures that even its outcasts contribute to its survival, that the condemned and the exiled continue to serve even as they suffer. The psychological reality of exile, as we have seen, is one of profound loss and difficult reconstruction. The exile must somehow build a new identity from the fragments of the old, must find purpose in a universe that has declared them purposeless, must maintain hope in the face of almost certain doom. Some succeed in this reconstruction, emerging as different but perhaps stronger versions of themselves. Others fail, descending into madness, corruption, or simple exhaustion. The outcome depends on a complex interplay of personality, circumstances, and chance that no amount of planning or preparation can fully control. The physical forms of exile, from penal colonies to servitorization to banishment to the Eye of Terror, represent different points on a continuum of suffering and utility extraction. Each is calibrated to extract maximum service while inflicting sufficient punishment to serve as deterrent. The explosive collars of the penal legions ensure compliance through immediate threat of death. The mind-wiping of servitors eliminates the possibility of resistance entirely. the corruption of the eye transforms the exiled into weapons against the Imperium they once served. Throughout all these variations, the Imperium demonstrates its commitment to waste minimization in the crudest possible terms. Nothing is discarded that might still serve, no matter how degraded or corrupted it has become. The failed Space Marine is sent on a death oath that will almost certainly kill him, but might take some enemies with him. The condemned criminal is transformed into a servitor that can perform tasks too dangerous or monotonous for free citizens. Even the traitors who fled into the Eye of Terror continue to serve the Imperium's purposes, their raids and attacks serving to justify military expenditures and remind the faithful of the consequences of heresy. The question of redemption, which runs through every form of exile, reveals the theological contradictions at the heart of the imperial faith. The Emperor is said to be infinitely merciful, yet his mercy manifests so rarely that it might as well not exist. The faithful are taught that service and sacrifice can earn forgiveness, yet the actual path to redemption is so difficult that virtually no one achieves it. This contradiction is not a flaw, but a feature, a way to extract maximum effort while managing expectations. The existence of successful redemptions, rare though they are, serves to validate the entire system. When Uriel Ventris returns from the Eye of Terror, when a penal legionnaire earns his pardon, when a death oath is fulfilled, these successes prove that the system works, that the Emperor's mercy is real, even if access to it is extraordinarily difficult. The fact that thousands or millions fail for everyone who succeeds is considered irrelevant. What matters is that success is theoretically possible, not that it is practically likely. For those watching from within the Imperium's hierarchies, exile serves as both warning and comfort. It is a warning because it demonstrates what happens to those who fail or transgress, the terrible fates that await those who step outside the narrow bounds of acceptable behavior. But it is also a comfort because it proves that the system has mechanisms for dealing with failure, that problematic elements can be removed and repurposed rather than simply destroyed. In a galaxy where threats press in from all sides and every resource matters, the ability to extract value even from failure is not just pragmatic, but essential. The exiles themselves, scattered across the galaxy in their various forms of banishment, represent a hidden cost of the Imperium's approach to governance and warfare. Each one is a person who might have contributed more had they been supported rather than punished, rehabilitated rather than exiled, understood rather than condemned. But the Imperium lacks the luxury of such considerations. It is a civilization in permanent crisis, fighting for survival against enemies that would destroy it entirely, given the chance. In this context, exile makes a terrible kind of sense. It is brutal and unforgiving, extracting service through suffering and offering redemption only to those who can achieve the impossible. But it is also efficient, converting failure into utility and ensuring that even those who have lost their place in the Emperor's design continue to serve his purposes. The exiles fight and die in the darkness, their sacrifices unrecorded and unremembered, and the Imperium grinds onward, sustained by the blood of both the faithful and the fallen. As we have journeyed through the various forms of exile that the Imperium employs, from the noble tragedy of the death oath to the existential horror of servitorization, from the brutal simplicity of the penal legions to the corrupting nightmare of the Eye of Terror, one truth emerges above all others. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is no escape from service. Even exile is simply service continued under different and usually harsher conditions. The condemned still serve, the exiled still fight, and all contribute to the Imperium's survival, whether they wish to or not. This is the reality of exile in Warhammer 40,000. Not abandonment, but transformation. Not release, but a different form of bondage. Not an ending, but a transition into a new and usually worse mode of existence. And in this reality, we see reflected the Imperium itself, a civilization that has become so efficient at extracting utility from humanity that even failure and punishment are simply additional mechanisms for perpetuating its endless war. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the dark realities of exile in Warhammer 40,000, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There's so much more of the 41st Millennium's grim lore to explore, from the horrors that lurk in the Eye of Terror to the desperate struggles of those who fight to protect mankind from a galaxy that wants nothing more than to see it destroyed. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and even exile is just another battlefield.